Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends. Quick question. How many people lived in the Americas before Columbus arrived in 1492? If you're like most folks, you probably learned it was just a few million at most. Sparse populations scattered across two giant continents. Small tribes living simple lives in harmony with nature. Basically empty land just waiting to be discovered and settled by Europeans. What if I told you that number was off by tens of millions? What if the history you learned in school wasn't just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong about nearly everything? The cities, the populations, the technology, the political systems, even how long people had been here, all of it radically different from what we were taught. Today, there are over 574 federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States alone. Thousands more throughout Central and South America. Millions of people carrying on traditions, languages, and knowledge systems that stretch back further than most of us circa. And imagine, they're here. They've always been here. But the story of how they got here and what they built along the way is nothing like the version in your history textbook. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking the comments and seeing Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, London in the afternoon, all experiencing this together. See, here's what happened. For generations, textbooks taught a very convenient narrative. Native Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago by crossing a land bridge from Asia. They lived in small nomadic groups as hunter-gatherers. They had no writing, no cities, no complex civilizations. When Europeans arrived, they brought civilization to an empty wilderness.
Except none of that is true.
Well, okay, some of it is partially true, but it's been simplified and sanitized to the point of being fiction. It's like describing modern America by saying people live in houses and eat food. Technically accurate, but missing absolutely everything that matters. The real story is so much stranger and more fascinating than the myth. It involves cities larger than London or Paris at their peak. Agricultural systems so sophisticated that modern scientists are still figuring out how they worked. Political confederacies that influenced the founding fathers when they wrote the Constitution. Medical knowledge that saved European lives even as Europeans were destroying native societies. And timelines that stretch back not 13,000 years, but possibly 20,000 or 30,000 or even longer. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you've been looking at something upside down? That moment when the image flips and everything makes sense in a completely different way. That's what's happening right now in archaeology, anthropology, and Native American studies. Every few years, another discovery pushes the dates back further, reveals another. Her massive settlement uncovers another sophisticated technology that wasn't supposed to exist. The textbook version of Native American history was written mostly by people who had never met a native person, never visited their lands, never tried to understand their cultures on their own terms. Or worse, it was written by people who had a vested interest in portraying indigenous peoples as primitive and uncivilized. Because if they were primitive, then colonization wasn't genocide. It was progress, manifest destiny, bringing light to darkness. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay buried forever, especially not when there are millions of descendants who never forgot their real history, who kept the stories alive through oral traditions, through ceremonies, through sheer stubborn refusal to let their cultures die. And especially not when modern archaeology keeps digging up evidence that contradicts the convenient myths. What you're about to hear isn't just a correction of historical facts, though there's plenty of that. It's a complete reframing of how we understand the human story in the Americas. From the first arrivals tens of thousands of years ago, through the rise and fall of civilizations that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia, to the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history, to the ongoing resilience of cultures that refuse to be erased. This is the history you were never taught. The one that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about civilization, progress, and what it means to be indigenous to a place. The one that's been hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to finally open our eyes and see it. So let's start at the very beginning. Or rather, let's start with what we thought was the beginning, and then watch it crumble under the weight of new evidence. For most of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans seemed settled. The Clovis people arrived around 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska during the last ice age. They moved south through an ice-free corridor, spread rapidly across the continent, and became the ancestors of all Native American peoples. Simple, elegant, completely wrong. The Clovis first theory dominated American archaeology for decades. It was taught in every textbook, featured in every documentary, accepted as established fact. Then, in the 1970s, a graduate student named Tom Dillehay started digging at a site in southern Chile called Monte Verde. What he found shouldn't have existed. Stone tools, wooden structures, preserved plant remains, all dated to at least 14,500 years ago, 1,000 years before Clovis. More importantly, it was in Chile, thousands of miles south of where the Clovis people supposedly first arrived. Do the math. If people were living in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they must have crossed into North America considerably earlier. Then they had to travel the entire length of 2 continents, adapt to dozens of different environments. Ornaments. Establish viable populations. That takes time, lots of time. The archaeological establishment fought Monteverde for decades. They questioned the dating methods, challenged the interpretation of artifacts, suggested contamination. But Dillehay was meticulous. He had organic materials sealed in peat bogs, stratigraphic layers that couldn't be mixed, multiple independent dating techniques, all converging on the same time frame. By the late 1990s, even the skeptics had to concede. Monteverde was real. The Clovis first theory was dead. But if Monteverde killed Clovis first, what came next rewrote the entire story. In 2021, researchers published findings from White Sands National Park in New Mexico. They'd found footprints, human footprints, of adults and children walking across the muddy shores of an ancient lake. The footprints were preserved in layers of sediment between deposits of aquatic plant seeds that could be precisely dated using radiocarbon methods. The dates were shocking. Between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Let that sink in. People were walking around New Mexico during the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered most of Canada and the northern United States. The ice ferry corridor they were supposedly using to migrate south didn't exist yet. It was buried under a mile of ice. So how did they get there? The answer probably lies in boats. For years, archaeologists had dismissed the idea of coastal migration. Early Americans were big game hunters, the theory went. They followed mammoth herds across the Bering Land Bridge. They didn't have maritime technology. They couldn't have traveled along the Pacific coast, except we now know that's nonsense. People have been using boats for at least 50,000 years, probably much longer. Aboriginal Australians reached their continent by sea at least 65,000 years ago. If they could cross open ocean, why couldn't people living along the North Pacific coast travel southward in boats? The coastal mile. Grain hypothesis actually makes more sense than the land bridge model in several ways. Coastlines provide reliable resources: fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds. You can travel long distances relatively quickly by water. And most importantly, the Pacific coast was ice-free during periods when the interior was locked in glaciation. A maritime route would have been open when the land route was impossible. The problem is, we can't find the archaeological sites that would prove it. Sea levels at the end of the Ice Age were 300 feet lower than today. The coastlines, where people would have lived and traveled, are now underwater. Any camps, villages, or processing sites from that era are buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. We're essentially trying to reconstruct human history with 90% of the evidence permanently submerged. But we're finding hints. On the Channel Islands of California, there are sites dating to over 13,000 years ago. These islands were never connected to the mainland. And, even during the Ice Age, the only way to reach them was by boat. The sites show evidence of sophisticated maritime adaptation, specialized tools for processing marine resources, remains of deep-water fish that could only be caught from boats. These weren't occasional coastal visitors. These were people whose entire culture was oriented around the ocean. Similar evidence keeps appearing at sites along the Pacific coast of North and South America. In Oregon at Paisley Caves, researchers found human coprolites, preserved feces dated to over 14,000 years ago. DNA analysis showed these people were eating freshwater fish and wetland plants, suggesting they were already well established in interior environments by that date. In Chile, at Huaca Prieta, archaeologists found fishing nets and hooks dating to 14,500 years ago. Again, evidence of sophisticated maritime technology far earlier than the Clovis first model could account for. But the real revolution came from genetics, when researchers began analyzing DNA from modern Native American populations and comparing it to ancient remains. They found something unexpected. The genetic diversity was far greater than any single migration could produce. There were distinct lineages, separate founding populations, evidence of multiple waves of migration spanning thousands of years. The current genetic evidence suggests at least 3 major migration events, possibly more. The first wave, arriving perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 years ago, gave rise to most Native American populations throughout North and South America. But there were later arrivals too. The Nodine peoples of northwest North America show genetic evidence of a separate migration around 12,000 years ago. The Inuit and Aleut peoples represent yet another wave, arriving only about 5,000 years ago. Even within that first major migration, there's evidence of complexity. Some genetic lineages appear to have diverged from each other long before arriving in the Americas. This suggests they might have been separated for thousands of years in Beringia, the land bridge region between Asia and North America. During the last glacial maximum, Beringia was actually a vast subcontinent, 1,000 miles wide, with its own distinct ecosystems. People could have lived there for millennia, adapting to local conditions, developing distinct cultural and genetic profiles before moving south into the Americas. There's even evidence suggesting possible pre-last glacial maximum arrivals. Some stone tools from sites in Mexico and Brazil have been dated to 30,000 years or older, though these dates remain controversial. If they're accurate, they would require multiple migration events spanning tens of thousands of years, with earlier populations potentially being replaced or absorbed by later arrivals. The DNA evidence also reveals unexpected connections. Some ancient American populations showed genetic markers more commonly associated with populations from Southeast Asia, Oceania, even Australia. This has led some researchers to propose a Pacific coastal migration route, with people island hopping along the Pacific Rim from Asia to the Americas. It sounds far-fetched until you remember that people reached Australia by sea 65,000 years ago. The technology existed. The question is whether anyone used it to reach the Americas. One of the most intriguing cases is the Luzia skeleton from Brazil, dated to about 11,500 years ago. Facial reconstruction suggested features more similar to Aboriginal Australians or Africans than to modern Native Americans. This sparked speculation about early migrations from different source populations. The skeleton was tragically destroyed in a museum fire in 2018, but the questions it raised remain unanswered. What we're seeing is a picture of the peopling of the Americas that's vastly more complex than anyone imagined 50 years ago. Not a single migration of big game hunters following mammoths through an ice corridor, but multiple wolves. Vests of migrants using diverse routes and technologies over tens of thousands of years. Maritime peoples traveling by boat along the Pacific coast, interior groups moving through temporary openings in the ice sheets, possibly even trans-Pacific voyages arriving from unexpected directions. Each wave brought different knowledge, different adaptations, different genetic and cultural contributions. These populations met, mixed, competed, cooperated. They adapted to every environment on two continents, from Arctic tundra to Amazonian rainforest, from coastal deserts to mountain highlands. And they did it over a time scale that's far longer than we ever acknowledged. The implications are profound. When we push back the arrival date from 13,000 years to 20,000 or 25,000 years, we're not just adding a few millennia, we're fundamentally changing our understanding of the depth of indigenous presence in the Americas. We're acknowledging that Native American peoples have occupied this land for as long as modern humans have lived anywhere outside of Africa. The Americas aren't some newly colonized frontier in human history. They're as ancient a homeland as anywhere on Earth. And we're just beginning to understand the true story. New sites are being discovered constantly. New dating methods are pushing boundaries further back. Underwater archaeology is finally beginning to explore those submerged coastlines where so much evidence lies hidden. Genetic analysis is becoming more sophisticated, revealing subtle population movements and mixing events that were invisible just a few years ago. Every new discovery adds complexity to the story, but that complexity is the point. The real history of the first Americans isn't simple, because human history is never simple. People don't migrate in neat waves following predictable patterns. They explore, adapt, innovate, sometimes succeed, and sometimes fail. They travel by whatever routes are available, using whatever technologies they can devise. And over thousands of years, they transform themselves and their environments in ways that leave traces we're only now learning to read. The people who first reached the Americas were among the greatest explorers in human history. They crossed continents, navigated coastlines, pioneered routes through some of Earth's harshest environments. And they did it so long ago that their journeys have been almost completely erased from the physical landscape. We're reconstructing their story from footprints preserved in ancient mud, from tools found in underwater caves, from genetic markers in the DNA of their descendants. It's one of archaeology's greatest detective stories, and we're still in the early chapters. But here's what we know for certain. By 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, people had spread throughout North and South America. They were established in diverse environments, developing distinct cultures and technologies, and they were about to do something unprecedented in human history. They were about to build civilizations. Let's get one thing straight right now. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they didn't find an empty wilderness dotted with primitive nomads living in teepees. They found cities, real cities. Cities with populations that would have made medieval Paris look like a village. Cities with urban planning that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Cities that had already risen, flourished, and been abandoned by the time Columbus got lost trying to find India. The biggest, Cahokia. And almost nobody's heard of it. Picture this. The year is 1250, AD. Not ancient history, medieval times. England has just started building Westminster Abbey. Paris is the largest city in Europe with maybe 200,000 people. And in the middle of what's now Illinois, across the river from modern-day St. Louis, there's a city that rivals them both, Cahokia. At its peak, somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 people lived there. The uncertainty in that number tells you everything about how thoroughly this place has been erased from popular consciousness. We know medieval Paris down to the street level, Cahokia. We're still arguing about whether it had 10,000 or 40,000 residents. But even the low estimate makes it larger than London at the same time. You're walking into the city on a warm summer morning. The first thing you see, the thing that dominates the landscape for miles, is Monk's Mound. It rises 100 feet into the air. A massive earthen pyramid with a footprint of 14 acres, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not built with stone blocks and slave labor, but constructed basket by basket, generation by generation. Millions of cubic feet of earth carried by hand and carefully shaped into a monument that would last 1,000 years. At the top sits the palace of whoever rules this place, chief, king, high priest. We still don't know the exact social structure, but from up there they can see the entire city spread out below. Hundreds of earthen mounds, some for temples, some for elite residences, some for purposes we can only guess at. Each mound positioned with mathematical precision. Between the mounds, thousands of houses, not simple huts, but sophisticated wooden structures with plastered walls, sometimes 2 stories high. Some areas show evidence of attached buildings forming courtyard complexes, apartment-style housing that wouldn't be reinvented in America for another 600 years. The streets are laid out in a grid. In 1250 AD, most European cities were organic tangles of winding alleys that had evolved randomly over centuries. Cahokia was planned. Someone sat down and designed this place, mapping out districts, plazas, residential areas. Archaeological surveys have revealed the grid extends for miles, showing a level of urban planning that suggests centralized authority and sophisticated administrative systems. And then there's Woodhenge. Actually, there are several Woodhenges, circles of mass. I've wooden posts erected on the western edge of the city, aligned to mark the equinoxes and solstices. Stand at the center on the spring equinox and watch the sun rise directly over a specific post. The people of Cahokia were tracking celestial movements with the precision of any European observatory of the time. They were predicting eclipses, planning agricultural calendars, creating a sacred landscape where earth and sky synchronized. Walk through the Grand Plaza. It's been artificially leveled and filled to create 50 acres of flat ground, the gathering place for ceremonies and possibly sporting events. Chunky was their game, rolling stone discs and throwing spears to land as close as possible. Archaeological evidence suggests they took it seriously, very seriously. Some burials show individuals apparently sacrificed after chunky tournaments, suggesting the stakes were higher than bragging rights. You can hear the city from miles away, the sounds of thousands of people going about their daily lives. Craftspeople working, children playing, traders haggling. The smell of cooking fires, the distinctive scent of corn being processed. Cahokia was the center of a trade network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians. They're finding exotic materials in Cahokia from sources 1,000 miles away. This wasn't a village. This was a cosmopolitan metropolis, a cultural and economic hub that dominated the Mississippian world. And then it was gone. By 1400 AD, Cahokia was abandoned, not destroyed by conquest, not burned by invaders, just empty. The people left.
We're still arguing about why. Climate change seems to have played a role.
The region experienced a series of droughts and floods that might have stressed agricultural systems. Overpopulation probably didn't help. When you pack tens of thousands of people into a pre-industrial city, sanitation becomes challenging. Disease outbreaks were probably common. But there's another theory. Maybe they left because they wanted to. Maybe centralized hierarchical societies aren't universally appealing. Maybe after a few centuries of living under chiefs or priests, people decided they preferred smaller, more egalitarian communities. Archaeological evidence shows the population dispersed, but didn't disappear. They just moved to smaller settlements scattered across the region. Cahokia wasn't unique. Head southwest, and you'll find something equally remarkable. The ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, though many modern Pueblo people don't use that term, were building cities in the desert when Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages. Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Between 900 and 1150 AD, this remote canyon became the center of a civilization that stretched across 100,000 square miles. They built great houses, massive stone structures up to 5 stories high with Hun. Dreads of rooms. Pueblo Bonito, the largest, contained over 600 rooms and 40 ceremonial chambers called kivas. These weren't random constructions. The buildings are aligned to solar and lunar cycles with astronomical precision. The walls are built with stone masonry that would impress any medieval European stonemason. Some walls are a meter thick, constructed with careful layering that's still standing 1,000 years later. And they built roads. Perfectly straight roads, up to 30 feet wide, stretching for hundreds of miles across desert terrain. Roads that go straight over mesas and cliffs rather than following easier terrain. Why build roads like that? We don't know. There's no evidence of wheeled vehicles. Maybe they were ceremonial, sacred paths connecting outlying communities to the canyon. Maybe they served economic purposes we haven't figured out yet. But here's what really gets interesting. The great houses required enormous amounts of timber, roofing a structure the size of Pew. Pueblo Bonito needs massive wooden beams. The problem? Chaco Canyon is essentially treeless. So they went and got timber from forests 50 miles away. They cut massive ponderosa pines and firs, some weighing 600 pounds, and transported them across desert terrain to the canyon. Tree ring dating shows they did this for generations. This required organization, planning, a labor force capable of coordinated effort, supply chains that could move heavy materials across long distances. This is civilization-level complexity. Then further north to Mesa Verde, Colorado. Between 1190 and 1300 AD, the ancestral Pueblones built something that still looks impossible today. Cliff dwellings. Entire villages built into alcoves in sheer sandstone cliffs, hundreds of feet above the valley floor. Cliff Palace contains 150 rooms and 23 kivas. It was built under an overhanging cliff, protected from rain and snow, positioned to catch winter sun for warmth and summer shade for cooling. The engineering is brilliant. They hauled stones, timbers, and water up those cliffs using hand and toe holds carved into the rock face. They created multi-story structures that cling to cliff faces with no mortar, just precisely cut stones fitted together. Living there must have been extraordinary. Wake up in your stone room carved into the cliff. Climb down ladders to reach the kivas for ceremonies. Look out across the valley from your alcove hundreds of feet up. The sense of security must have been immense. Nobody's attacking a cliff dwelling without significant effort. But again, abandonment. By 1300 AD, Mesa Verde was empty. Climate change, probably. The region experienced a catastrophic drought in the late 1200s. When your agriculture depends on careful water management and the rain stops coming, cities become untenable. But the people didn't vanish. They're the descendants of the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who have maintained cultural continuity for 7 centuries. These weren't Noma. These weren't primitive hunter-gatherers scratching out a bare survival. These were urban civilizations with sophisticated architecture, astronomical knowledge, extensive trade networks, and social structures complex enough to organize labor forces building monuments that would last a millennium. And there were others. The Hohokam in southern Arizona built over 500 miles of irrigation canals, creating an agricultural system that supported cities of thousands. The canals were so well engineered that modern Phoenix uses some of the same routes. The Poverty Point culture in Louisiana, from 1700 to 1100 BC, built massive earthwork complexes, including one of the largest mounds in North America, predating Cahokia by 2,000 years. When Europeans arrived, most of these cities were already ancient ruins. The people had dispersed, transformed, reorganized into different social structures. So Europeans saw abandoned cities, assumed they were always abandoned, and invented myths about lost civilizations, and mysterious ancient peoples who had vanished without a trace. The truth is simpler and more interesting. Cities rise and fall. Civilizations transform. People make choices about how they want to live. Sometimes they build massive, urban centers. Sometimes they decide those centers aren't working and return to smaller communities. Neither choice makes them more or less civilized, but the myth persisted. Native Americans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They didn't build cities, didn't have civilization, were living in some primitive state before Europeans arrived to civilize them. That myth dies hard, but it needs to die, because understanding what was actually here, the sophistication and complexity of indigenous American civilizations, changes everything about how we understand this continent's history. These weren't empty lands waiting to be settled. These were lands with their own urban traditions, architectural genius, and social experiments that rose and fell on their own. In terms long before any European ship appeared on the horizon, the stones are still there. The mounds still rise from the earth. The cliff dwellings still cling to their rock faces. Physical evidence that demands we revise our assumptions and recognize indigenous Americans as the civilization builders they always were. Here's what most people think when they hear Amazon rainforest: pristine wilderness, untouched nature, the lungs of the earth, existing exactly as it has for millions of years. A place where humans were just visitors, living lightly on the land, leaving no trace. Every part of that is wrong. The Amazon isn't a wilderness. It's a garden. A massive, continent-spanning garden that was carefully designed, planted, and maintained by indigenous engineers over thousands of years. And we only figured this out by accident. In the 1960s, archaeologists started noticing something odd in the Amazon. In certain areas, the soil was completely different from the surrounding rainforest. Instead of the typical nutrient-poor dirt that characterizes most tropical forests, they found patches of incredibly rich, dark earth. Locals called it terra preta, black earth, and they'd known about it for generations. Wherever you found terra preta, crops grew better, way better. Scientists were baffled. How did this soil get here? Natural processes don't create these kinds of nutrient concentrations in tropical environments. Rain washes everything away too quickly, so they started testing the soil composition. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about the Amazon. Terra preta isn't natural, it's manufactured. A sophisticated agricultural technology developed by indigenous peoples starting around 2,500 years ago, maybe earlier. They created it by combining charcoal, bone, manure, and organic waste in specific proportions, then working it into the soil over generations. The result was a super soil that could remain fertile for centuries, even millennia. Some terra PTA deposits are still more productive than surrounding soils today, 500 years after the cultures that created them collapsed. But here's where it gets wild. These patches of engineered soil aren't rare. They're everywhere. Researchers have identified terra preta sites covering potentially 10% of the Amazon basin. That's an area roughly the size of France. All of it human-made. All of it evidence of sophisticated environmental engineering on a scale that would make modern agricultural scientists jealous. And the implications go further. When researchers started analyzing which plant species grow in terra preta areas versus natural forest, they found something remarkable. The trees growing in these engineered soils are predominantly useful species. Brazil nut trees, cacao, fruit trees, palm species that provide food, fiber, and construction materials. The Amazon rainforest isn't a wilderness where humans occasionally gathered wild foods. It's an orchard, a food forest planted and managed by indigenous peoples who understood ecological engineering in ways we're only beginning to grasp. Some researchers estimate that up to 12% of tree species in the Amazon are there because ancient peoples planted them, cultivated them, and spread them across the basin.
Think about that for a moment.
The symbol of pristine nature, the place we point to when we talk about wilderness, turns out to be one of the largest human-engineered landscapes on Earth. But the Amazon wasn't unique. Turn your attention north to what's now the United States, and you find engineering projects that rival anything in the ancient world. Southern Ohio, near the town of Peebles. There, snaking along a cliff top overlooking a creek, is something that shouldn't exist according to the old narratives. The Great Serpent Mound, a massive earthwork shaped like an undulating serpent stretching 1,348 feet from head to tail. Its body curves in 7 distinct coils before ending in a tightly wound spiral tail. The head is aligned with the summer solstice sunset. It was built at least 2,000 years ago, maybe older. Nobody knows for certain because earthworks don't leave the kind of evidence you can easily date. But what we do know is staggering. Moving that much earth required organization, planning, a society capable of mobilizing hundreds, maybe thousands, of workers for a project that served no obvious practical purpose. This wasn't a dwelling. It wasn't a fort. It was something else entirely. Art, architecture, and astronomy combined in a single statement carved into the landscape itself. And it's not alone. The Ohio River Valley contains thousands of earthwork sites. Massive geometric enclosures covering dozens of acres. Perfectly circular mounds arranged in precise astronomical alignments. Complex shapes that required sophisticated surveying and mathematical knowledge to construct. The Hopewell culture, who built many of these structures between 100 BCE and 500 CE, weren't primitive villagers SCR, hatching out a living in the wilderness. They were engineers conducting landscape-scale projects that required abstract reasoning, complex social organization, and technological capabilities we're still trying to fully understand. Some of these earthworks were part of extensive road systems. The Great Hopewell Road ran for 60 miles, connecting the massive geometric enclosures at Newark to the ceremonial centers at Chillicothe. 60 miles of raised earthen highway built to precise widths and alignments, complete with what appear to be rest stops and ceremonial sites along the route. This is infrastructure. This is civil engineering. And it was happening while Rome was still building its empire. Move west into the desert southwest, and you find something equally impressive but completely different. Water engineering. The Hohokam people of what's now Arizona faced a challenge that would have stumped most ancient civilizations. How do you farm in a desert? Not a temperate region with occasional, only droughts, but actual desert, places where rainfall is measured in inches per year, not feet, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Their solution was to move the rivers. Between roughly 300 CE and 1450 CE, the Hohokam constructed over 500 miles of irrigation canals in the Phoenix Basin alone. Not small ditches, major engineered waterways, some over 10 feet deep and 30 feet wide, capable of moving massive volumes of water from the Salt and Gila rivers to agricultural fields scattered across the desert floor. These weren't simple channels dug in straight lines. They were sophisticated hydraulic systems with headgates to control flow, distribution networks to split water between multiple fields, and gradient calculations precise enough to move water dozens of miles without it either flooding or stagnating. Modern engineers studying Hohokam canals have found they used principles of hydraulic engineering that wouldn't be formalized in European textbooks for another 1,000 years. They understood water velocity, erosion control, and sustainable flow rates. Some of their canals are still visible today. A few were even reused by modern Phoenix because 19th-century American engineers realized the Hohokam had already figured out the optimal routes. At its peak, this irrigation system supported a population of possibly 50,000 people in the Phoenix Basin alone. In the desert, growing corn, beans, squash, cotton, and agave using technologies that transformed one of the harshest environments in North America into productive agricultural land. But then something happened, something that erased most evidence of these achievements and created the illusion that Native Americans had never altered their landscapes. European colonization didn't just kill people. It killed the knowledge systems that maintained these engineered landscapes. Terra preta requires constant maintenance. You have to keep adding the right mix of materials, working it into the soil, understanding. The biology of nutrient cycling. When the diseases arrived and populations collapsed, that knowledge died with the people who held it. The gardens went wild. The The forest reclaimed areas that had been managed for millennia. Within a few generations, landscapes that had been carefully shaped by human hands looked natural to European eyes. The earthworks faded differently. Some were deliberately destroyed by settlers who saw them as obstacles to farming or who vandalized them in the search for imaginary treasures. Others were simply plowed under, their sophisticated geometries reduced to scattered piles of dirt. Of the thousands of mounds that once covered the Ohio Valley, only a fraction remain. The rest are parking lots, farm fields, and suburbs. Evidence of indigenous engineering buried under the infrastructure of their conquerors. The irrigation systems of the Southwest collapsed when epidemic diseases killed the people who maintained them. Without constant management, canals filled with sediment. Headgates broke. Water flows became unpredictable, then stopped entirely. The desert reclaimed fields that had been green for 1,000 years. And because these landscapes transformed so quickly after contact, because the European colonizers arrived after the collapse was already underway, they saw empty land, unused land, wilderness waiting to be tamed by civilization. They never saw the gardens, the earthworks, the irrigation systems in their full functioning glory. They only saw the ruins, and they didn't even recognize those as human creations. This misperception became foundational to American identity. The idea of the frontier, of taming wilderness, of bringing civilization to empty lands. All of it based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The lands weren't empty. They weren't wild. They had been carefully managed for thousands of years. Europeans simply arrived after the managers were gone. And now, as we're finally beginning to recognize what was here, we're realizing something profound. The Native American relationship with land wasn't about leaving nature untouched. It was about shaping nature intelligently, creating ecosystems that were more productive, more diverse, more resilient than what existed before. They weren't conservationists in the modern sense. They were ecosystem engineers, and they were remarkably good at it. The question isn't whether Native Americans transformed their landscapes. They absolutely did. The question is why we spent so long refusing to see it. Here's what we know. When Europeans began arriving in the Americas in serious numbers in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found what they described as an empty wilderness. Vast forests with no sign of human management. Prairies that stretched to the horizon with only scattered bands of nomadic people. River valleys that could support cities but held only small villages. And from this, they drew a conclusion that would shape 5 centuries of history. The Americas had always been sparsely populated, a pristine wilderness waiting to be claimed and civilized. But here's the problem. They were looking at a graveyard. They just didn't know it yet. The debate about pre-Columbian population numbers has raged for decades. Conservative estimates from the mid-20th century put the total population of the Americas at maybe 8 to 10 million people in 1492. That's roughly the population of modern New York City, spread across 2 entire continents. These numbers seem to confirm what European colonists had always claimed. The Americas were mostly empty, lightly populated, underdeveloped. Then archaeologists started actually looking. They found city sites, agricultural earthworks, fish weirs, shell middens stretching for miles, terraced hillsides, irrigation canals, the accumulated physical evidence of dense permanent settlement. And the numbers started changing. By the 1960s, some researchers were arguing for 40 million people. By the 1980s, estimates reached 60 million. Today, some scholars push the number even higher, 80 million, maybe 100 million people living in the Americas when Columbus landed. That would have made the Western Hemisphere as populous as Europe at the same time. The supposed empty wilderness was actually one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. But if that's true, where did everyone go? The answer is a catastrophe so overwhelming, so complete, that it fundamentally distorted European understanding of West. They were actually seeing. Because by the time most Europeans arrived to document indigenous societies, they weren't observing intact civilizations. They were observing the survivors of an apocalypse. Picture it this way. It's 1492. A few ships arrive in the Caribbean. The crews interact with local populations. They share food, trade goods, exchange breath and conversation. And in that exchange, they deliver something far more devastating than any weapon: disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Diseases that had been endemic in European and Asian populations for thousands of years, giving those populations some degree of immunity through natural selection. But the Americas had been isolated from these pathogens for 15,000 years, since their ancestors first crossed from Asia. Native American immune systems had never encountered these viruses. They had no genetic defenses, no acquired immunity, no cultural knowledge of how to treat these particular diseases. What happened next wasn't just an epidemic. It was a biological apocalypse that unfolded in waves across 2 continents. Here's what makes this catastrophe almost impossible to comprehend. The diseases moved faster than the Europeans themselves. A Spanish expedition would land on a coast, make contact with local populations, and leave. Weeks later, the people they'd met would start getting sick. The disease would spread from village to village along trade routes, carried by people who didn't even know they were infectious. By the time the next European expedition arrived in the region, maybe years later, entire populations had already been decimated. The archaeological evidence supports this timeline. Excavations of village sites in the Mississippi Valley show thriving communities through the 1400s and early 1500s. Then suddenly mass graves appear. Villages are abandoned. The sophisticated chiefdoms that had existed for centuries simply vanish from the record. And all of this happens before any European set foot in the interior of North America. When Hernando de Soto marched through the southeast in 1539 to 1542, he encountered powerful chiefdoms with large populations, fortified towns, and extensive agricultural systems. When French explorers traveled through the same regions 150 years later, those chiefdoms were gone. They found scattered remnant populations living in much simpler settlements. No memory of the great towns that had stood just a few generations earlier. The death toll was staggering. Modern epidemiologists estimate that virgin soil epidemics, diseases hitting populations with no prior exposure, can kill 90 to 95% of affected populations. That's not 90 to 95% death rate among the sick. That's 90 to 95% of everyone. 9 out of every 10 people dead within a generation or two. Try to imagine that scale of loss. Not an individual tragedy, not even a community tragedy. An entire civilization experiencing near extinction. Villages where everyone over age 5 died, leaving only young children who couldn't remember how things had been before. Towns where the only survivors were those who happened to be away when the disease struck. Entire languages vanishing because all the native speakers died before they could teach the next generation. The cultural loss was incalculable. Specialized knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years disappeared overnight. Master craftspeople died without passing on their techniques. Historians who kept oral records died before they could train successors. Priests who maintained astronomical observations, agricultural experts who knew which crops to plant when, healers who understood which plants treated which ailments, all gone in a matter of months or years. And the land itself changed. This is what Europeans fail to understand when they describe the Americas as a pristine wilderness. What they were seeing wasn't natural. It was the result of catastrophic depopulation. Remember those managed forests we took? I looked about earlier. When 90% of the people maintaining them died, the management stopped. Controlled burns ceased. Hunting pressure dropped. Within decades, forests that had been deliberately kept open and park-like grew thick and tangled. Europeans saw this dense undergrowth and assumed it had always been that way. They were actually looking at abandoned gardens gone wild. The agricultural landscapes disappeared even faster. Without people to maintain the terraces, they eroded. Without people to clean the irrigation canals, they filled with silt. Without people to tend the fish weirs, they fell apart. Within a generation or two, landscapes that had supported hundreds of thousands of people reverted to something that looked like wilderness to European eyes. This is where the myth of the empty continent comes from. Not from reality, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of what Europeans were actually observing. They arrived expecting to find either civilization as they understood it, meaning cities and states and written records, or they expected to find savages, primitive people living in harmony with nature. When they found neither, when they found remnant populations living in seemingly simple conditions in seemingly unmodified landscapes, they assumed this was the natural state of things. But we have evidence of what it actually looked like before. Early explorers, the very first European contacts, described something completely different. When Giovanni de Verrazzano sailed up the Atlantic coast in 1524, he described the landscape near what's now North Carolina as so delightful and pleasant that we thought we must be in some Arcadia or paradise. He saw fields under cultivation stretching for miles, forests that were open and park-like, and populations dense enough that he could see smoke from countless fires rising along the coast. When French explorers first reached the Great Lakes in the early 16th century, they described rivers so full of fish that you could circumstantially walk across on their backs. They described flocks of passenger pigeons so vast they darkened the sky for hours. They described forests full of deer, elk, and bear in numbers that seemed impossible. This wasn't pristine wilderness. This was a carefully managed landscape at the peak of its productivity, and it was managed for populations far larger than what Europeans would encounter just decades later. By the time the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, the catastrophe was already well underway. The site they chose for their settlement, the cleared fields they found ready for planting, wasn't abandoned out of convenience for them. It was the site of Patuxet, a Wampanoag village that had been completely wiped out by disease just a few years earlier. They were literally building on graves, settling in a land that had been emptied by an apocalypse they didn't understand and hadn't witnessed. The weight of this catastrophe, the sheer emotional and cultural devastation, rarely makes it into history books. We talk about percentages and population estimates, but we rarely sit with what that actually means. The trauma of watching everyone you know die, the guilt of survival, the impossibility of maintaining your culture when there's nobody left to teach it to, the grief of seeing landscapes your people had shaped for thousands of years grow wild and strange because there aren't enough survivors to care for them. Imagine trying to maintain your identity, your language, your traditions when 90% of your people are gone, when the elders who held the knowledge are dead, when there aren't enough young people to learn all the skills that need to be passed on. You have to triage your own culture, deciding what can be saved and what has to be let go, because there simply aren't enough survivors to preserve everything. And this happened everywhere from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Wave after wave of disease struck indigenous population. NS. The timing varied by region. The death toll varied by population density and isolation. But the pattern was the same. First contact, followed by catastrophic die-off, followed by societal collapse, followed by European arrival into a landscape already emptied. The Americas that Europeans colonized weren't the Americas that had existed before contact. They were the echo of something far more complex, far more populous, far more sophisticated. And because Europeans never saw what had been, because they only saw the aftermath, they built their understanding of indigenous peoples on a foundation of fundamental misunderstanding. They assumed they were observing the natural state of Native American societies when they were actually observing those societies in the midst of the worst catastrophe in human history. The empty wilderness wasn't real. It never was. It was a myth born from timing. From arriving just after the apocalypse and assuming that what you were seeing was how it had always been. But something survived. Some knowledge was preserved. Some communities held together even as the world they knew was ending. and what they built afterward, what they created in the shadow of catastrophe, tells us something profound about resilience, about adaptation, about the human capacity to rebuild even when everything seems lost. Picture this. It's 1754, and Benjamin Franklin is sitting in Albany, New York, trying to convince the British colonies to unite against the French. He's got a plan, something he calls the Albany Plan of Union. But here's the thing. It's not really his plan. Not entirely. He's borrowing heavily, almost shamelessly, from a political system that's already been functioning successfully for over 300 years, right under his nose. A system run by people his society doesn't even consider civilized. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy. 5 nations, later 6, united under a constitution so sophisticated it would make most European monarchies of the time look like feudal chaos. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca had figured out something that Europeans were still dying in wars over: how to maintain independent sovereignty while creating a unified government for common concerns. How to balance individual freedom with collective security. How to maintain peace between people who had every reason to be enemies. They called it the Great Law of Peace, Guyana Shagawa, and it wasn't some vague collection of traditions. It was a detailed constitutional framework with checks and balances, separation of powers, and democratic processes that would have seemed almost impossibly advanced to most of the world in the 15th century, when it was established. Here's how it worked. Each nation maintained complete control over its internal affairs. No central authority could tell the Mohawk how to run their villages or the Seneca how to manage their resources. But for matters affecting the whole Confederacy, warfare, trade agreements, diplomatic relations, ions with other peoples, they met in a grand council. 50 sachems, peace chiefs, represented the 5 nations, not proportionally, interestingly. The Onondaga had 14 sachems, the Cayuga 10, the Mohawk and Oneida 9 each, the Seneca 8. This wasn't based on population. It was designed to ensure no single nation could dominate. Decisions required consensus, not simple majority. Every sachem had to agree before the Confederacy took action. If consensus couldn't be reached, the matter was tabled, sent back to the individual nations for further discussion. Think about what this means. In an era when European kings could declare war on a whim, when divine right meant absolute power, the Haudenosaunee had created a system where no decision affecting the whole people could be made without extensive debate and universal agreement, where power was distributed so evenly that tyranny became structurally impossible. But here's where it gets really remarkable. Those sachems, those leaders with the P. To commit their nations to war or peace, they weren't chosen by warriors or male councils. They were chosen by women, specifically by the clan mothers, the senior women of each clan, who held the power to nominate leaders and, crucially, to remove them if they failed in their duties. This wasn't symbolic. The clan mothers held real political power. They could veto declarations of war. They controlled food supplies, which gave them economic leverage over military campaigns. They had the final say in matters involving children, land use, and resource distribution. In many ways, they held more practical power than the sachems themselves. European observers didn't know what to make of this. Their entire political philosophy was built on patriarchy, on the idea that political power naturally flowed from male military might. The concept of women holding veto power over war, of female leaders choosing male representatives, it broke their brains. So, mostly, they just ignored it, pretended to. Hey, didn't see it. Or dismissed it as savage customs not worthy of serious political consideration. But the Founding Fathers knew. Benjamin Franklin had extensive contact with Haudenosaunee leaders. He attended treaty negotiations. He observed their council meetings. Thomas Jefferson had Iroquois delegates at Monticello. John Adams studied reports of their governmental systems. They were fascinated by a functioning democracy in a world dominated by monarchy. The Albany Plan of Union, which Franklin proposed in 1754, bears striking resemblance to that structure. Independent colonies maintaining sovereignty over internal affairs but united under a common council for matters of mutual concern. The idea of confederacy, of unity, without centralization. It wasn't invented in Philadelphia. It was borrowed, adapted, sometimes acknowledged, but more often quietly appropriated from people who had been practicing sophisticated democratic governance for centuries. And the Haudenosaunee weren't UN. Eek. Across North America, indigenous peoples had developed political systems of stunning sophistication and remarkable diversity. The Muskogee Creek Confederacy in the southeast operated as a complex alliance of towns, each maintaining independence while cooperating on regional matters. They had developed what anthropologists call a dual governance system. Red towns focused on military matters, war chiefs and warriors making decisions about defense and conflict. White towns focused on peace, diplomacy, and civil affairs. Power shifted between red and white leadership depending on circumstances, creating a built-in system of checks and balances. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit, Haida, and other coastal peoples organized themselves into complex house systems. Each house was an economic and political unit led by leaders whose authority came from their ability to manage resources and maintain the house's prestige through elaborate, gift-giving ceremonies called potlatches.
Power was
Inherited automatically. It had to be earned and maintained through demonstrated generosity and wisdom. The Osage on the Great Plains developed a moiety system, dividing their entire society into two halves. Sky people and Earth people. Each half had specific responsibilities. Sky people handling war and hunting, Earth people managing agriculture and peace. You had to marry someone from the opposite moiety, creating kinship bonds that linked every person to both halves of society. Political decisions required cooperation between the moieties, ensuring no faction could dominate. What's striking about all these systems is how different they are from European political models of the same era. Europeans organized politically around hierarchy, power flowing down from kings to nobles to commoners. Authority came from the top, enforced by violence or the threat of violence. Native American systems, by contrast, tended to organize around consensus and persuasion. Leaders led by example. Oratory, not by coercion. A Cherokee peace chief who couldn't convince people to follow him simply wasn't a leader anymore. Power flowed from the people upward, not from authority downward. This created political cultures that European observers often found baffling. Colonial records are full of frustrated governors complaining that indigenous leaders couldn't control their people, couldn't force compliance with treaties. What they were really observing was the fundamental difference between authoritarian and consensus-based governance. Native leaders didn't have the power to force anyone to do anything. They had to persuade, negotiate, build agreement. And this worked spectacularly well, in many cases, precisely because it was decentralized. When decisions required broad consensus, you got buy-in from the community. People followed through because they'd been part of the decision-making process. Contrast this with European systems where kings could commit nations to wars that their people opposed, where subjects had no voice in decisions that determined their lives. The diplomatic networks that indigenous peoples created across North America demonstrate just how sophisticated their political systems were. Trade routes stretched thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. These weren't just economic networks. They were political relationships, carefully maintained alliances that required constant diplomacy, negotiation, gift exchange. The ancestral Pueblones created a trade network that moved seashells from the Pacific coast to communities in New Mexico, turquoise from southwestern mines to people in Mexico and beyond. Each exchange was a political act, a renewal of relationships, a reaffirmation of alliances. These networks required standardized protocols, agreed-upon rules of conduct, methods for resolving disputes. In other words, international law. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated systems of to national relations centuries before European concepts of international law emerged. But here's what really matters about all this political sophistication. It was systematically ignored, dismissed, or actively suppressed by European colonizers and their descendants. The Founding Fathers could borrow ideas from indigenous governance while simultaneously denying that indigenous peoples were capable of civilization. Anthropologists could document complex political systems while classifying the peoples who created them as primitive. This wasn't accidental. Recognizing the political genius of Native American governance would have undermined the entire justification for colonization. If these peoples had sophisticated democracies, while Europe was ruled by monarchies, if their women held political power while European women couldn't vote, if their consensus-based systems created stable societies while Europe tore itself apart in religious wars, what right did Europeans have to claim superiority? What justification existed for taking their land? So the political achievements were buried, dismissed as savage customs, rewritten as primitive tribalism. The same democratic principles that influenced the Constitution were stripped from the historical record when applied to their indigenous origins. The clan mothers who held real political power became invisible in colonial accounts. The sophisticated diplomatic networks became mere trade routes. The consensus-based governance that prevented tyranny became evidence of weak leadership and political chaos. We're still living with the consequences of that erasure. Still teaching civics classes about democracy's origins in ancient Greece and Enlightenment Europe while ignoring the functioning democracies that existed in North America for centuries before European contact. But the evidence is there, in the historical record, in the oral traditions that survived, in the very structure of American government that borrowed so heavily from indigenous models. The political genius wasn't forgotten because it never existed. It was forgotten because remembering it would require acknowledging a truth too uncomfortable for the colonial narrative to accommodate. That genius is still there, still visible to anyone willing to look past the myths and see what indigenous peoples actually created. Political systems built on consensus rather than coercion, on persuasion rather than violence, on balance rather than domination. Systems that in many ways were more democratic, more egalitarian, and more successful than what replaced them. Imagine lying on your back in a field 1,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now the American Midwest. No streetlights, no airplanes, just a sky so dark and clear that the Milky Way looks like a river of crushed ice. Above you, the stars rise and set with perfect regularity. To most people, it's just beautiful. To your ancestors, it was data. They weren't guessing. They weren't casually noticing that sometimes there are stars. They were tracking them night after night, year after year, generation after generation. At Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, they built a circle of red cedar posts aligned to the solstices and equinoxes. Archaeologists call it Woodhenge. It wasn't a random circle. When the sun rose at just the right point on the horizon, the alignment marked the change of seasons. The time to plant, the time to harvest, the time to hold ceremonies. In the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones carved spiral petroglyphs where a dagger of sunlight would pass through or over the spiral at the solstice, a stone clock driven by the tilt of the earth. Farther south in Mesoamerica, the Maya developed calendar systems of astonishing precision. They weren't just counting days, they were tracking cycles. The 260-day ritual calendar, the 365-day solar year, the long count that could measure centuries. They recorded eclipses, predicted planetary movements, and built observatories with here windows and corners aligned with Venus rising or the Pleiades appearing at dawn. To them, astronomy wasn't a separate science. It was the framework that tied agriculture, religion, politics, and time itself into a single coherent system. And this pattern wasn't limited to famous cities. Across the Americas, from the Arctic to the Amazon, people studied the sky as carefully as any modern astronomer, but with different tools. No telescopes, no computers, just patient observation and memory wrapped in stories and ceremony so they would never be forgotten. The same careful attention appears in medicine. You've probably heard the stereotype that indigenous medicine was just superstition, while real medicine began with Europe. The record suggests something very different. Many of the drugs that modern pharmacology depends on were first learned from indigenous healers, then stripped of their origins. Willow bark, used by native peoples for pain and fever, contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. The bark of certain South American trees provided the compound that became quinine, one of the earliest effective treatments for malaria. The arrow poisons used by indigenous hunters in the Amazon eventually led to the development of modern muscle relaxants used in surgery. Even tobacco began as a powerful ritual and medicinal plant used in controlled, meaningful contexts, centuries before it was turned into a mass-market commodity. None of this was random trial and error. You don't safely test hundreds of plants by accident. You do it with method, with observation, with memory. Healers watched which plants animals chewed when injured, how different preparations, raw, boiled, dried, smoked, changed the effects. They learned which combinations were dangerous, which were healing, which needed ritual framing, because the medicine was as much social and spiritual as biochemical. Among the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Navajo, the Maya, the Quechua, the Mapuche, and many others, medical knowledge was maintained as a specialist discipline. Apprenticeships could last years. Knowledge was transmitted cautiously, often only to those who'd proven they could handle its responsibilities. When European doctors later collected this information, they wrote it down in Latin and English, filed it into textbooks, and the original sources faded into the footnotes or vanished altogether. Behind the medicine and astronomy lay something that modern people don't always recognize: mathematics. You might not see chalkboards or equations, but counting systems were everywhere. The Inca developed a base 10 system with place value organized through quipus, bundles of knotted cords. Different knot types and positions represented numbers. Colors and groupings added layers of meaning. To the untrained eye, they looked like simple strings. To a specialist, they were ledgers, census records, tax accounts, maybe even narratives encoded in numerical sequences. Maya scribes used a vigesimal, base 20, system with a concept of 0 centuries before it appears in many parts of Europe. They recorded enormous calendar intervals, performed complex calculations, and created tables that could predict eclipses over long time scales. Counting wasn't just for trade. It was for tracking cycles, managing tribute, organizing labor, and tying events to precise dates. Even in small-scale societies without monumental architecture, mathematical thinking was embedded in daily life. Systems for counting shells, pelts, or baskets used consistent units. Distributions of food and goods at feasts followed structured patterns. Oral rules encoded ratios and fair shares. You don't see digits on a page, but you do see numeracy at work. Proportional division, sequence, equivalence, obligations tallied and remembered. And all of this stars, medicines, numbers had to be stored somewhere. In a world without widespread writing, indigenous peoples of the Americas built memory palaces in sound instead of saint. 1. Oral traditions weren't just entertaining stories. They were living archives. Among the Hada or Telinget on the northwest coast, lineage histories, rights to fishing grounds, and territorial boundaries were wrapped into epic narratives and song cycles. Among the Dene, complex ceremonial chants preserved diagnostic systems, treatment sequences, cosmological maps, and ethical guidelines. In the Andes, myths traced routes across mountains and valleys, encoding where water could be found, where frost came early, where landslides had once destroyed villages. To an outsider, a story about a trickster or culture hero might sound like a myth. To insiders, it was also a set of instructions. When to burn the prairie, when to leave a field fallow, when the salmon run would arrive, what to do if the snow came late or the river failed.
Details were fixed. Elders corrected younger reciters. If they left out a line, reversed an order, misnamed a plant.
Accuracy wasn't a bonus. It was survival. TH.
is precision extended into ecological knowledge. Long before phrases like sustainability or ecosystem management were invented, indigenous societies were already running long-term experiments in how to live with a landscape without destroying it. On the Pacific coast, selective burning created rich mosaics of habitat, encouraging berries, game animals, and specific useful plants. In the southeast, controlled fire kept forests open, reduced catastrophic wildfires, and maintained conditions ideal for both agriculture and hunting. In the Amazon, so-called pristine jungle hides anthropogenic forests. Groves of Brazil nuts, cacao, and fruit trees, carefully tended over generations, and patches of dark, fertile terra preta soil created by intentionally adding charcoal, bone, and organic waste. On the Great Plains, bison hunting wasn't random slaughter. It was guided by knowledge of herd behavior, grass growth, and migration patterns. Overhunting in one area risked starvation, later communication. Nitties developed norms and taboos to prevent it, embedding ecological limits inside spiritual narratives. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters read subtle variations in snow, ice, wind, and animal tracks, a multivariable calculus performed with the eyes, ears, and skin. These were science systems, not science in the lab coat sense, but science as systematic observation, hypothesis, testing, refinement, and long-term feedback. The instruments were seasons, stories, and agreements about what worked and what had once gone terribly wrong. And yet, so much of this intellectual heritage didn't survive contact. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and later government officials rarely recognized indigenous knowledge systems as knowledge at all. Astronomical alignments were dismissed as coincidence. Medicines were appropriated without credit. Counting systems were called primitive. Oral traditions were treated as legends, interesting perhaps, but not reliable. Then came deliberate erasure, boarding. Schools and mission schools punished children for speaking their own languages, the very languages that carried the technical vocabularies of plant use, ritual, astronomy, and law. Elders who once transmitted specialized knowledge found themselves with no apprentices, or with grandchildren too frightened to be seen learning old ways. Sacred sites aligned to solstices were built over, quarried, flooded by dams. Healers were prosecuted as sorcerers. Keepers of ceremonial songs watched their roles outlawed or forced underground. Libraries of knowledge that had been maintained in human memory for centuries unraveled in a few generations. Some of it survived anyway, hidden in families, whispered in kitchens, practiced in remote valleys. Some of it has been partially reconstructed by native scholars working with elders, archaeologists, linguists, and botanists. But much of it is gone. Entire pharmacopoeias, ecological models, astronomical records, and philosophical systems that we will never fully recover. When we say Native Americans are not who we thought they were, this is part of what we mean. They were not simply people living close to nature in a vague, romantic sense. They were scientists of place and time, mathematicians of memory, physicians of plant and story, astronomers of a sky unpolluted by light. And when that knowledge was attacked, the loss wasn't only theirs. It was a loss for humanity as a whole. The next part of this story takes us into a darker chapter, where the assault on indigenous minds and cultures becomes organized, systematic, and relentless. An attempt not just to control land, but to rewrite memory itself. By the time Europeans arrived in the Americas, native societies had already spent thousands of years practicing something that rarely makes it into school textbooks: power politics. They were not wandering aimlessly through untouched wilderness. They were running states, coalitions, war leagues, and diplomatic networks. When the first Spaniards, French, Dutch, and English ships appeared on the horizon, native leaders did not freeze like deer in headlights. They did what their ancestors had always done when a new power entered the neighborhood. They studied them, tested them, negotiated with them, used them. The stereotype you were probably taught is simple. Native people as passive victims, overwhelmed by superior European weapons, technology, and organization. A tragic but inevitable collapse, curtain falling. But the record tells a different story. For centuries after first contact, Europeans were the ones scrambling to keep up. Again and again, colonial powers found themselves outmaneuvered by indigenous strategies they barely understood. Imagine you're a European commander, trained in the rigid warfare of 17th century Europe. Lines of musketeers, drums and flags, forts laid out in clean geometric shapes. You arrive in North America expecting the same game with different players. Instead, you find a continent where war is something else entirely. Native armies fought in flexible, decentralized units. They used the land as armor. Forests, swamps, riverbends, canyons. They moved silently over distances European soldiers thought impossible, guided by generations of knowledge about trails, weather, animal movements. Hit-and-fade attacks, night raids, decoys, feigned retreats that lured enemies into carefully prepared ambushes. Operations planned not just for days, but sometimes for seasons, based on when rivers froze, when certain plants bloomed, when game migrated. European officers wrote in their journals about invisible enemies. Units vanished into the trees and reappeared miles away. Supply lines that seemed secure suddenly burned. Scouts disappeared without a sound. Whole expeditions went missing in terrain. Native scouts crossed in a single day. It wasn't magic, it was systems. Systems of training, communication, and command that had been refined over generations of intertribal warfare, ritual conflict, and shifting alliances. Some native societies specialized in this. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois, built a war machine that terrified both rival native nations and European colonies. Raiding parties could strike deep into enemy territory, coordinated through councils of sachems who weighed intelligence, omens, and political consequences. In the southeast, the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and later the Seminole used similar strategies, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes fighting the British, Spanish, or Americans, sometimes fighting alongside them, but always, at the deepest level, fighting for room to survive. And on the Great Plains, once horses spread north from Spanish colonies, equestrian warfare evolved into something the European imagination had never truly seen. Mounted warriors from nations like the Lakota, Comanche, and Cheyenne could move with speed and precision that made fixed forts and slow infantry columns nearly obsolete. Cavalry officer. Sirs who had studied Napoleon suddenly found their tactics aging centuries in a single campaign. Yet war was only one part of the equation. The other, often more important part, was diplomacy. When European empires looked at native nations, they saw potential subjects. When native leaders looked back, they saw potential allies, tools, and sometimes temporary shields against other threats. They understood something many colonists did not. Europe's power in the Americas was fragmented. Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, later the United States. None of them were unified, all powerful forces sweeping across the land. They were rival players in a crowded political landscape, and native leaders learned to play them off against each other with astonishing skill. Picture the early 1700s. French traders building alliances along the St. Lawrence and Mississippi. British colonies hugging the Atlantic coast. Native polities in between, holding the real balance of power. Haudenosaunee diplom. ATs traveled to Montreal and Albany, listening carefully to both sides, extracting gifts, guarantees, and trade terms. They promised support, but never absolutely. They negotiated from strength, not desperation. Their confederacy had already been mediating disputes, forming treaties, and maintaining complex balance of power arrangements among their member nations for centuries. Further south, the Creek Confederacy learned to leverage Spanish Florida, French Louisiana, and British Carolina against each other. One European power promising guns, another offering missionaries, yet another conceding territory to keep peace along a crucial frontier. Creek leaders turned this competition into breathing room, supplies, and at times recognition of borders that existed nowhere on European maps. To the west, the Comanche created what some historians call an empire, without ever using that word themselves. Through a mix of war, trade, and political marriage, they built a region where Spanish and Mexican authorities had to treat them not as a scattered tribe, but as a sovereign power whose consent was needed for any major move. These were not accidents. They were strategies born of clear-eyed calculation. And when open resistance became necessary, the leadership behind it was often as sophisticated as anything in Europe or Asia. Think of Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader in the early 1800s. He did something incredibly ambitious. He tried to form a pan-Indigenous alliance across tribal, linguistic, and cultural lines to resist U.S. expansion. Not just a loose coalition of war parties, but a continent-spanning political project. He traveled from the Great Lakes to the southeast, giving speeches remembered decades later for their power and clarity. His message was radical. The land does not belong to individual tribes to be sold off in pieces. It belongs to the nations collectively, a shared inheritance that cannot be signed away by a few chiefs at a treaty table. In another world, with slightly different timing, his vision might have reshaped the map. But he faced an opponent whose population, industrial power, and hunger for land were growing at breakneck speed. After his death in 1813, the alliance he'd built began to fragment. Or consider the Lakota leader Sitting Bull, often portrayed as a doomed holdout against the inevitable. But for decades, he was anything but doomed. He navigated an increasingly tight corridor of possibility with extraordinary skill. He understood that armed resistance alone could not stop the United States. So he combined it with something else: refusal. Refusal to sign away land. Refusal to move to reservations under impossible terms. Refusal to accept a narrative in which his people's future only existed on someone else's schedule. When the U.S. government declared him an outlaw, he crossed into Canada, appealing not just to British officials, but to international conscience. It didn't save his people's territory in the long run, but it delayed dispossession, bought time, and preserved a core of independence that would echo through his descendants. In the Southwest, leaders of the Apache, like Cochise, and later Geronimo, practiced a different style of resistance. Highly mobile, decentralized, rooted in intimate geographic knowledge of mountains, canyons, and deserts. They tied down thousands of U.S. and Mexican troops for years, not by winning pitched battles, but by making conquest unbearably expensive. And through all of this, alliances continued. Not simple, permanent alignments, but fluid, situational partnerships. Some native nations sided with the British against the Americans in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, betting reasonably that a distant king might be easier to manage than a land-hungry republic. Some fought alongside the Union or Confederacy in the U.S. Civil War, calculating which outcome offered the best chance of survival. Others tried to remain neutral or to become mediators, only to be pulled into conflicts by broken promises, invading settlers, or diseases that respected no treaties. The myth of inevitable defeat hides how long resistance lasted. In much of North America, organized military resistance continued well into the late 19th century. In places like the Amazon, the interior of North America's Northwest, and parts of the Arctic, meaningful autonomy survived in some form until the 20th century. And even where the guns fell silent, the struggle did not end. It changed shape. Into courtrooms instead of canyons, at treaty tables instead of river ambushes, through petitions, legal challenges, newspaper articles, and later international forums. Leaders like Standing Bear of the Ponca, who argued in a U.S. courtroom in 1879 that a native person was legally a person. It sounds absurd now that this needed to be argued, but his quiet insistence forced a judge to acknowledge something the law had refused to say out loud. Or the Haudenosaunee diplomats, who in the 20th century traveled with their own passports, asserting a sovereignty that predated both Canada and the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, resistance took on new forms again. Occupations of sites like Alcatraz Island and Wounded Knee, legal fights for fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest, movements that used cameras and television instead of spears and muskets, but aimed at the same target: survival with dignity. Today, the resistance continues in ways that might look quiet on the surface, but are no less profound. Language revitalization programs, battles over pipelines and water rights, legal campaigns to uphold treaty obligations signed generations ago, efforts to reclaim sacred sites and protect them from mining, logging, or tourism. Wars now fought in environmental hearings, university curricula, and digital spaces. When you step back, a pattern emerges. For centuries, Native Americans were not simply pushed aside by some unstoppable historical wave. They responded again, and also. With creativity, courage, and strategic intelligence. On battlefields, in council houses, and later in courtrooms and classrooms, they confronted empires and nation-states that often assumed their victory was already written. But history isn't written in advance. It's negotiated, resisted, reinterpreted. And while many native nations lost land, lives, and autonomy on a staggering scale, they did not vanish. They adapted. They are still here, still fighting in different ways for the same basic things their ancestors defended with bows, muskets, treaties, and speeches under open skies. Land, language, community, and the right to decide their own future. To understand that is to let go of the image of native people as shadows fading into the past, and to begin seeing them instead as what they have always been: agents, strategists, warriors, diplomats, and above all, survivors. The story of cultural destruction doesn't start with barbed wire and watchtowers. It starts with classrooms. Picture this. It's the late 1800s. The military campaigns are winding down. The cavalry charges, the burning villages, the massacres, those are becoming less common. But the goal of US and Canadian policy hasn't changed. The goal is still control. The tactics just move indoors. A new idea takes hold among policymakers, missionaries, reformers who called themselves friends of the Indian. If they couldn't erase native nations physically, they would erase them culturally. Not by killing the people, but by killing the people inside them. Kill the Indian in him, and save the man. That sentence was actually spoken by Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was the mission statement. The method was simple and ruthless. Take native children as young as 4 or 5. Remove them from their families, often by force or by threats of withholding rations. Transport them hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. Give them new names, new clothes, new haircuts. Forbid their languages. Outlaw their ceremonies. Punish any attempt to hold on to what their grandparents had taught them. On paper, this was called education. In practice, it was a massive experiment in cultural erasure. Imagine you're 6 years old. You grew up hearing your grandmother's stories in your language. You know the smell of your home, the sound of drums in the distance, the pattern of the stars above the place where your people have always lived. Then, one day, strangers arrive, soldiers, agents, missionaries. They tell your parents it's the law. They tell them it's for your own good. They tell them if they refuse, the tribe might lose food, or even their other children. You end up in a stone building 3 days' journey away. The first thing they do, when you walk in the door, is take your clothes, the woven dress your aunt made, the shirt your grandfather gave you gone. They cut your hair, sometimes while you cry and struggle. For many native nations, hair wasn't just decoration. It carried spiritual meaning, family stories, social status. Watching it fall to the floor wasn't just a haircut. It was a kind of mourning. Then comes the language. You open your mouth to ask a question in the only words you've ever known, and a hand comes down on your shoulder hard. Maybe it's a strap, maybe it's a ruler, maybe it's soap shoved into your mouth. English only, they tell you, or French only. Your words. The ones your ancestors refined over thousands of years, the ones that carried knowledge of plants, animals, treaties, migrations, astronomy, law, humor, prayer. Those words are suddenly dangerous. Some children adapt quickly
Because they have to. Others fall silent. A few refuse to speak at all for months. Teachers call them slow, backward, primitive. In reality, their worlds have been ripped in half. For the governments involved, this wasn't some accidental byproduct of schooling. This was the point. Official documents talked openly about breaking tribal ties, about civilizing native children by separating them from savage influences.
The logic was chillingly straightforward. If a child no longer thinks in their people's language, no longer remembers the stories, no longer knows the ceremonies, then in a few generations there will be no nation left to negotiate with, no culture left to claim treaties, lands, or sovereignty. This is where the trauma starts to seep out of the past and into the present. Because children don't just experience this and leave it behind when they graduate or escape. They carry it in their nervous systems, in their parenting, in their silence. Intergenerational trauma isn't just a metaphor, it's a pattern. A child who was beaten for speaking her language might grow up to have children of her own. When a son asks why she never taught him those words, she might say she was trying to protect him, that she didn't want him to suffer what she did. So an entire grammar that survived ice ages, migrations, wars, ends at a kitchen table where a mother shakes her head and says, "No, we don't talk that way anymore." That silence echoes. You can trace it through generations. A grandparent who went to boarding school drinks too much and never talks about their childhood. Their children grow up with an unpredictable parent, learning to walk on eggshells. Their grandchildren inherit anxiety, depression, a constant sense of not quite belonging anywhere. Therapists call it complex trauma. Native communities call it life. Underneath all that, language is quietly disappearing. Language isn't just vocabulary. It's a way of carving reality into meaningful pieces. Many indigenous languages. Usages of North America encode relationships that English barely hints at. Verbs that tell you whether an action is reciprocal, whether it includes the listener, whether it respects the animal involved. Words for kinship that distinguish not just aunt and uncle, but older and younger, maternal and paternal, joking and serious. Terms for landscapes that carry centuries of observation about water levels, animal behavior, climate shifts. When those languages are lost, it's not just poetry that disappears. It's ecological knowledge, legal systems, philosophies, entire ways of organizing human life. Boarding schools didn't just produce kids who spoke English. They produced gaps. Missing words where songs used to be. Missing ceremonies where seasonal gatherings once anchored the year. And the schools themselves were not safe. For over a century, tens of thousands of native children passed through these institutions across the US and Canada. Many survived, and some even remember individual tea. Eachers who were kind. But woven through those memories are others. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, forced labor, medical neglect, disease outbreaks, children who got sick and never came back from the infirmary. For a long time, these stories were treated as exaggerations or not believed at all outside native communities. Then, the ground began to speak. In the 2020s, using ground-penetrating radar and archival research, investigators in Canada and the United States began to locate unmarked graves on former residential and boarding school sites. Small bodies beneath schoolyards and orchards and fields. Children whose parents were told they had run away or fallen ill, with no details, no grave to visit, no ceremony to perform. The numbers are still being investigated, and different sources offer different estimates, but the pattern is undeniable. Children were taken. Many did not return. Their resting places were not marked. Their names were often not recorded. The grief their families ride had no official recognition for generations. Now, belatedly, there is a reckoning. Governments have issued apologies, some more sincere than others. Churches that ran many of the schools have begun internal reviews. Commissions have taken testimony from survivors who describe in detail what it felt like to be a child in those institutions. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of boots in the hallway at night, the way the sky looked through barred windows, the taste of punishment meant to scrub out their mother tongues. Survivors' stories are not identical. Some speak of friendships forged under pressure, of secret acts of resistance, whispering in their language under blankets, singing band songs in storage rooms, smuggling bits of culture through cracks in the system. Others relive intense suffering, every time they close their eyes, because boarding school was where their innocence ended. What unites these testimonies is a quiet, fierce insistence. This happened not in some distant prehistoric past, but within living memory. Many of the people telling these stories are grandparents today. Some are still middle-aged. This isn't ancient history, it's family history. And yet, even here, the story is not only about destruction, it's also about refusal. Because the policy goal of the boarding school era was clear: cultural death without physical genocide. End the languages, the ceremonies, the political identities, and leave behind individuals who might call themselves American or Canadian, but would not say Navajo, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lakota, Muskogee, or Mohawk with the full weight of those nations behind the words. That goal failed. It failed because grandparents who had been beaten for speaking their language sometimes whispered it anyway to a favorite grandchild. It failed because elders smuggled songs into church hymns, wrapped stories in Bible verses, hid medicine knowledge in gardening advice. It failed because children ran away from schools and walked home. Across vast distances, following rivers and rail lines and stars. It failed because language once learned can go dormant without fully dying. A few remembered words become a seed. When a new generation decides to learn, to reclaim, to record, that seed can sprout again. Today, across North America, there are immersion schools teaching children languages that the boarding school system tried to stamp out. There are university courses in Indigenous law, guided by elders whose grandparents were punished for practicing those legal traditions. There are ceremonies held openly that once had to be hidden in remote clearings or behind shuttered windows. The trauma hasn't vanished. It's layered into bodies, families, communities. It shows up in statistics about health, poverty, addiction, and in quiet moments when an elder pauses before trying to talk about their childhood, then changes the subject. But the resilience is just as real. The boarding school era was one of the most intense attempts. PTs at cultural erasure in modern history, yet the cultures it targeted are still here, bruised, transformed, adapting, but here. Languages once whispered are being sung again by children on playgrounds. Ceremonies once banned by law are conducted under the open sky. The assault on culture was deliberate. Its wounds are deep. Its legacy is ongoing. But like the survivors of the ancient bottleneck, who carried their genes through 117,000 years of near extinction, Native peoples today carry stories, songs, and identities that have survived every policy designed to end them. The question now is not whether those cultures endured. They did. The question is whether the rest of society is willing to finally hear what they have to say. Picture the version of Native Americans most of us grew up with. Close your eyes and hold the image there for a second. A man on horseback, maybe. Dark braids, feathered headdress, fringed buckskin, either staring nobly at a polluted river or riding in circles round a wagon train, whooping and firing arrows. That image feels familiar because you've seen it 1,000 times in cartoons, in old westerns, on cereal boxes, on football helmets. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That figure you're imagining isn't a real person. It's a composite character assembled out of myth, marketing, and movie scripts. A kind of cultural hologram projected over hundreds of distinct nations, thousands of years of history, and millions of individual lives. To understand who Native Americans actually are, We have to gently turn down the brightness on that hologram. Look at the machinery behind it and notice how much of what we think we know was simply invented. Start with two of the strongest myths, the noble savage and the bloodthirsty warrior. They sound like opposites, but they're really twins. The noble savage is the idea that native people were pure, innocent, in perfect harmony with nature, almost childlike in their simplicity. The bloodthirsty warrior, the flip side, savage, cruel, irrationally violent, incapable of civilized life. These stereotypes show up together because both of them do the same work. They make native people less than fully human. Not complex, not strategic, not political, just symbols. In one scene, the noble savage stands silently on a cliff, gazing at the sunset, sad but resigned to the coming of progress. In the next, the warrior charges over that same hill, nameless and faceless, just another obstacle for the hero to overcome. Real history looks nothing like this. There were warriors, of course, just as there were in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. People fought over territory, honor, resources, and revenge. They also negotiated treaties, brokered peace, adopted captives, intermarried with former enemies, and formed alliances that stretched across continents. There were spiritual leaders who cared deeply about the land, who understood ecological relationships with a level of sophistication that still surprises Odin scientists. And there were also opportunists, schemers, people who overhunted or made bad decisions, just like in any other society. The noble savage fantasy erases the science and statecraft. The bloodthirsty warrior fantasy erases the diplomacy and law. Both erase the fact that these were full societies with philosophers, comedians, inventors, politicians, parents, rivals, friends. So where did these images actually come from? Not from native people, from Hollywood. Imagine a casting call in 1940s Los Angeles. The script needs Indians. Not Lakota, not Diné, not Haudenosaunee, Muskogee, or Coast Salish, just Indians. A generic category, a costume choice. Producers rummaged through a grab bag of cultural elements. Plains war bonnets, southwestern jewelry, generic chants, invented sign language, and stitched them together into a single standard issue, Native American. In reality, there were more than 500 distinct nations in what is now the United States alone, and thousands across the Americas. Different languages, different governments, different religions, different clothing, different architecture, different ideas about war, gender, family, and property. But on screen, one size fits all. So a tribe that historically farmed corn in permanent towns suddenly rides everywhere on horses. They didn't actually adopt until centuries after first contact. A nation that never wore feathered headdresses is dressed head to toe in them. A people who built multi-story stone cities in the desert are reduced to anonymous riders circling a wagon train screaming. Directors reuse the same few props. Costumers recycle the same outfits. And background actors are told to do the same war whoop again and again. In the space of a few decades, an entire continent's worth of cultural diversity was compressed into a handful of visual clichés. Once those images solidified on screen, they began to leak out into everything else. Children's toys, Halloween costumes, car commercials, team logos. Along the way, a lot of traditions were simply invented and then projected backwards onto native peoples. Think about the solemn peace pipe ceremony you've seen in a dozen films, always staged the same way. Or the idea that every native language had the same mystical-sounding word for Great Spirit, or that every tribe sat in perfectly circular councils, passed around a talking stick, and made decisions by unanimous consent. Some of these practices have distant roots in actual traditions. Others are pure fiction created by non-native writers who needed something that would read as spiritual to a general audience. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, white writers penned Indian speeches that were completely made up but presented as authentic. Politicians quoted them. Schoolbooks reprinted them. Posters framed them. Meanwhile, real native leaders were giving actual speeches about land rights, sovereignty, and treaty violations, and those were ignored. In other words, the voice we W. Air, given as the native voice, was often a ventriloquist act, a non-native hand moving native lips, saying what non-native audiences wanted to hear. You can still see the effects today. Every time a sports fan paints on war paint, throws on a fake headdress, and runs onto a field to the sound of a synthetic tomahawk chop. Mascots turn entire peoples into props. A stylized Indian head logo on a helmet, a grinning cartoon face on a jersey, a rubber tomahawk in the gift shop. Generations grew up shouting fake war cries on Friday nights, never learning the names of the actual nations whose homelands they were standing on. It's casual. It's normalized. And it trains the brain in a quiet lesson. These people are characters, not neighbors. Costumes, not citizens. The same logic shows up in jokes, in offhand comments about Indian givers, in the idea that someone with no connection to any native community can declare themselves part Cherokee based on a family myth and a cheekbone. When you see a people primarily as a mascot, it becomes easier to ignore their laws, their treaties, their court cases, their elders, their scientists, their artists. Easier to treat the living communities as an afterthought and their imaginary past selves as the main story. But step outside the movie frame for a moment, and the diversity of actual indigenous life comes into focus. Look at a linguistic map of North America before colonization. It doesn't look like a few big blocks of color. It looks like a mosaic. Hundreds of languages, many of them as different from each other as English is from Japanese. Algonquian languages along parts of the Atlantic coast. Iroquoian languages in the northeast. Muskogean languages in the southeast woodlands. Siouan languages across parts of the plains. Athabascan tongues stretching from subarctic Canada all the way to the deserts of the southwest. Uto-Aztecan languages tying the Great Basin to central Mexico, and dozens more, each with its own poetry, its own H. Umar, its own ways of talking about time, land, and kinship. Dress, ceremony, and belief were just as varied. Some nations built earth-covered lodges that stayed warm through brutal winters. Others constructed towering plank longhouses on the Pacific coast with elaborately carved poles telling family histories. Some raised monumental mounds aligned with solstices and star risings. Others moved seasonally with salmon runs or bison herds, following patterns older than many European cities. Ideas about property and governance ranged from highly centralized chiefdoms to complex federations, from strict hereditary leadership to councils where ordinary people could override a chief's decisions. There were matrilineal societies where clan identity and land rights passed through the mother's line. There were nations where certain clans specialized in diplomacy, others in ceremony, others in war. Even the relationship to animals and landscapes was not one simple, uniform, living in harmony with nature. Story. It was 1,000 different specific relationships, burned prairies to encourage certain grasses, pruned forests to favor nut-bearing trees, fished and irrigated and terraced, each tuned to local ecologies over centuries of observation and experiment. So when someone says, Native Americans believed X, or Native Americans did Y, that's usually a sign that the Hollywood composite is speaking again, not the real people. Why does any of this matter, especially in a video meant to put you to sleep? Because the stories we quietly absorb before bed, in classrooms, in childhood movies, become the default settings of our minds. They shape who we see as fully human, whose pain registers, whose achievements impress us, whose claims seem legitimate. Correcting these misconceptions isn't about being polite. It's about reality calibration. When you replace a cardboard cutout with a three-dimensional person, everything changes. Policy debates look different when you remember that NA. Tive nations are governments, not interest groups. Environmental discussions look different when you realize many conservation discoveries were rediscoveries of land management practices indigenous communities had refined over centuries. Even personal identity shifts when part Indian myths give way to real relationships with actual native nations or honest acknowledgement of distance. Seeing through the myths doesn't make the story smaller. It makes it bigger, richer, more surprising. Instead of a single tragic figure fading silently into the sunset, you get a continent full of living cultures still arguing, still adapting, still creating, still speaking languages that survived boarding schools and bans and punishment. You get scientists designing climate resilience projects based on traditional ecological knowledge, lawyers arguing complex sovereignty cases, artists remixing tradition into new forms, kids learning languages once declared dead. When the Hollywood lies fall away, the Eel's story comes into view, and it turns out to be far more interesting than anything that ever made it onto a soundstage in 1953. The question then is simple. Once you see the myths for what they are, what else in the story is waiting to be seen anew? Now shift the camera in your mind, not to mammoths or ancient cities, not to ruined mounds or collapsed empires, to a traffic light turning red outside a tribal casino, to a kid scrolling on a cracked phone in a high school hallway on Pine Ridge, to a native scientist calibrating a microscope at 2 a.m. in a university lab, to a drum group rehearsing in a community center next to a basketball court. Because one of the biggest mistakes we make when we talk about Native Americans is the tense. We talk about them in the past. We use words like were and used to. We talk about tribes that lived here as if they got up and left the stage so the modern world could come on. But open your eyes to the present. There are more Native people alive today in the Americas, than at almost any point in the last 500 years. New babies, new songs, new laws, new battles, new ideas. Not a vanished world, a living one. The past tense problem isn't just a grammatical slip. It's a way of erasing people while they're still here. School textbooks show tippies and buckskin, then quietly stop the story around 1900, as if native life froze in sepia tones and never made it to color. Movie westerns end with the cavalry riding in, or with the last stand of a doomed tribe. Roll credits. Fade to black. But outside the theater, beyond the pages, a different story kept unfolding. Languages people said were dead kept being whispered to children. Ceremonies that were outlawed went underground, held in basements, remote clearings, hidden valleys. Elders carried words and songs like embers cupped in their hands, waiting for a time when it would be safe to let them blaze again. That time is now. Across the continent, something remarkable is happening. Language class. Assessments in community centers and Zoom rooms. Immersion schools where toddlers argue in Mohawk, in Navajo, in Cherokee. Teenagers joking in Ojibwe on TikTok. Radio stations broadcasting in Lakota, Yupik, Hawaiian. Languages that were once punished with soap in the mouth or with a strap across the knuckles in boarding schools are now printed on street signs, school banners, government documents. This is not nostalgia. This is engineering. Revitalization is deliberate, structured, scientific. Linguists work with elders to record every sound, every idiom. Young adults train as teachers, creating children's books, apps, video games. Sometimes there's only one fluent elder left in a community, a single living library. Entire teams gather around them with cameras and microphones, capturing as much as they can before time closes that door. Then those recordings become seeds. A word spoken to a microphone today becomes a lullaby sung to a newborn 10 years from now. This is what a cultural renai
Sense looks like. Not costumes in museums. Committees, Zoom calls, curriculum design, grant applications. And somewhere in the middle of all that paperwork and planning, someone laughs in a language that nearly disappeared. Of course, language alone isn't culture, but it's the skeleton that stories hang on. When a language comes back, ceremonies expand, jokes get better. Old songs suddenly make sense again. And as culture grows, something else reawakens too. Political power. In the United States, Canada, and many countries in Latin America, native nations are not simply ethnic groups. They are governments. Tribal sovereignty is the quiet,
stubborn fact that native nations have a legal and political existence that predates the states that swallowed their homelands. It isn't full independence. It's a tangled web of treaties, court cases, and hard-won rights. Some nations run their own courts, their own police, their own school systems, health clinics, housing programs. They negotiate with ATA rights, energy projects, casino compacts. Supreme Courts debate questions that sound simple, but are anything but. Who has jurisdiction on this land? Who can arrest whom? Who can tax what? Whose law is the law? When lines on maps overlap, each case can feel arcane, technical, full of acronyms and footnotes. But underneath, the stakes are deeply human. Whose children are protected? Whose rivers are poisoned or preserved? Who gets to say no when a company wants to drill, mine, or dump? Sovereignty isn't an abstract principle. It's a shield some tribes manage to hold on to, dented and battered, but still capable of deflecting harm. And slowly, very slowly, this legal reality is being recognized, expanded, tested. At the same time, native people are stepping into every arena. The past tense narrative pretends they don't exist. A Dene astronomer helping to design Mars missions. A Haida artist whose formline designs hang in world museums. A Laguna Pueblo writer winning national awards. Native lawyers arguing major cases before Supreme Courts. Native legislators writing bills. Native astronauts looking down at their homelands from orbit, carrying beadwork or eagle feathers into space. In labs, Indigenous geneticists and ecologists weigh questions of data ownership and ethics, asking who should control biological samples from native communities, who should profit from traditional knowledge of plants and medicines. In cities far from reservations, large native populations thrive in places people rarely associate with them. Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, Mexico City, Sao Paulo. They form urban Indian centers, powwow committees, college student unions, activist networks. Many navigate multiple identities at once. Urban and tribal, modern and traditional, switching registers like switching languages. Some code software by day and dance in full regalia at night. Some are punk musicians and ceremonial singers. Some are quiet, private, uninterested in any label at all. The Int is simple. Native life is not a museum exhibit. It's messy, contradictory, funny, painful, ordinary, brilliant, like any other human life. And intertwined with all of this lore, language, art, science there is the land. Because you cannot tell the story of native nations today without talking about where they stand. Literally. Throughout the Americas, native communities are at the forefront of environmental struggles. They stand in front of pipelines and block trucks. They challenge dams, mines, oil projects. Sometimes, the headlines reduce this to protest. But under the slogans and banners, there's a deeper framework. Land back. Land back doesn't always mean ejecting everyone else. More often it means restoring native control over sacred sites, forests, watersheds, places where decisions are made with 7 generations in mind, not the next quarterly report. In some places, this is already happening. Tribal nations co-manage national parks. Ancient shell mounds and mound sites are turned to local tribes. Watersheds are placed in legal guardianship where rivers are granted personhood and Indigenous councils guide their care. Traditional ecological knowledge fire regimes that prevent megafires, fishing practices that maintain salmon runs, agroforestry systems that keep soils alive is now studied by ecologists and climate scientists trying to understand how to live on a heating planet. What some call innovation is often the revival of methods that worked for thousands of years, paused only by a few violent centuries of interruption. As you listen, maybe you notice a pattern. The same societies that were dismissed as primitive turn out to have sophisticated governance systems that influenced modern democracies. The same farming methods dismissed as backward turn out to be climate resilient. The same spiritual ties to place dismissed as superstition now look like blueprints for sustainability. None of this means native cultures are frozen relics of a better past. They are not time capsules. They are laboratories. New ceremonies emerge. Old ones are adapted for city life. Bilingual rap tracks weave traditional drums with digital beats. Novels mix creation stories with science fiction. A young person might learn their language through an app built by another native developer who lives thousands of miles away but shares the same ancestral verbs. Elders speak into microphones, their voices compressed into audio files, then carried by fiber optic cables under oceans and highways, reaching grandchildren on another continent. Ancient wisdom running on modern infrastructure. Some communities are thriving. Others are still hurting deeply from poverty, addiction, suicide, the long shadow of boarding schools. Trauma doesn't disappear when laws improve or when hashtags trend. But alongside that pain, there is resilience so ordinary it often goes unnoticed. Grandparents raising grandchildren, women organizing community gardens, language tables in church basement. Immense. Sobriety circles in gymnasiums. Mutual aid networks sparked during pandemics or wildfires. Quiet daily acts of survival and care. When you put it all together, the lawsuits and land trusts, the immersion schools and art shows, the protests on muddy riverbanks, the laughter at Kitchen Tebazu, start to see Native America not as a vanished world, but as a network of living cultures, still adapting, still inventing, still carrying lineages that reach back thousands of years, not frozen in time, moving through it, shaping it. So the next time you hear someone say, Native Americans used to, let that phrase linger in your mind, and remember that somewhere right now, a native child is Va, falling asleep to a bedtime story told in a language that survived outlawing and near erasure. Somewhere a council meeting is running late while people argue over budgets and water rights. Somewhere a dancer is sewing the last jingles onto a dress. A coder is fixing bugs in a language learning app. AL. Aya is drafting a brief that could change who controls a river. The story didn't end. It turned a page, and the cultures we were taught to see only in sepia photographs are still here in full color, stepping into a future they've been preparing for far longer than most of us have realized. So now, as you lie there in the dark, maybe with your eyes half closed, the story of America probably doesn't look quite the same anymore. Not a blank wilderness waiting to be discovered, not a side chapter that begins in 1492, but a deep, continuous human story, old, layered, complex, a continent mapped in memory, long before it was mapped on paper, road systems where we once saw only trails, cities where we once imagined only villages, carefully managed forests and rivers where we once pictured untouched nature. When you learn that native peoples engineered soils, redirected water, bred crops that feed most of the modern world, and built political systems that may have influenced modern democracy. The old schoolbook version of American history, starts to feel small, flattened, almost like looking at a mountain range on a child's drawing, and then suddenly flying over the real thing. You begin to realize how much has been left out, not just events and dates, but ways of thinking, ways of relating to land, to community, to time itself. And here's the quiet, unsettling part. If we were this wrong about the past, what else might we be missing in the present? Because these aren't lost peoples. They're neighbors, they're co-workers, they're scientists, artists, lawyers, language teachers, tribal leaders, teenagers scrolling their phones just like everyone else. More than 500 distinct federally recognized nations in the United States alone, and more beyond its borders, each with its own history, its own debates, its own future. Seeing history anew means understanding that Native Americans are not frozen in museum glass, not stuck in a single moment of the 1800s, not defined only by tragic eddy or resistance. They are participants in every chapter of the story we're still writing. Climate policy, constitutional law, environmental restoration, art, music, and film. Questions about what it means to live well on this earth. If you want this new understanding to be more than a pleasant late-night thought, the next step is simple. And it doesn't have to be dramatic. Start listening. Seek out Indigenous historians, writers, podcasters, and elders telling their own stories. Read a tribal nation's website instead of only a textbook summary. When you travel, learn whose land you're visiting and how they name it, how they remember it. Notice how the same landscape can hold more than one story at once. Each new voice you hear adds another layer to the map in your mind. Each layer makes the continent richer, more real, more human. As you drift towards sleep, you don't need to remember every date, every name, every detail. What matters is the shift, the sense that the ground beneath. The familiar narrative has opened up, revealing older roots, deeper networks, a longer memory. The feeling that American history doesn't start at a shoreline with 3 ships, but in countless campsites, gardens, plazas, and council fires stretching back through millennia. If this journey through the hidden side of that story has kept you company tonight, you can help it reach other people who were taught the same narrow version of the past. When you wake up, or if you're still awake now, you can gently tap the like button. It tells the algorithm that quiet, thoughtful history is worth sharing. You can also leave a comment if you'd like. Maybe share where you're listening from, the city, the region, or, if you know it, the indigenous nation whose land you're on. Those comments become a kind of living map, a reminder that this history is not abstract. It's under your feet. And if you'd like to hear more long, slow stories like this, more deep dives into the parts of the past that rarely make it into the spotlight, you can subscribe to the channel. That way, the next time you're looking for something calm and curious to fall asleep to, these stories will be waiting for you. There's also an optional membership here on YouTube for those who want to support the channel a little more directly. It's never expected, and you should only join if it feels right for you. But if you do, know that it helps make the time, research, and care behind these episodes possible. For now, you don't need to do anything. You can just lie there breathing slowly, letting the noise of the day drain away. Somewhere in the dark behind your eyes, you can picture those ancient cities, those engineered fields, those long trade routes running like threads across the continent. You can imagine fires burning low in winter lodges, stories being told, knowledge being passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. That story hasn't ended. You're living in one small part of it. Let your thoughts drip. Feet. Let the timelines blur and soften. Let the names and places fade into a gentle background hum. History will still be here in the morning. For now, you can rest. Good night.